Yeah. Ashley, you want me just to jump in and begin?
Yes, as soon as the computer strikes 4:30, please.
It says record. It's got recording and live on the screen, so I think we're good to go. Awesome. Hey, welcome everyone. I know there's some here, on the Google Meets, and I think there's others watching the live stream, and so that's fantastic. I'm Mike Redmond. I'm the superintendent of Shakopee Public Schools, and I'm going to share a presentation on our financial outlook, and then follow that up. We've got Christy Peterson, our school board chair, and Bill Manazzi, our finance director, and I will answer questions that can be sent in via email, and I'll share that in just a little bit how to do that. Right now, I'm going to share my computer screen and begin the presentation. As I mentioned, this was, the title of this is Financial Outlook, but really when we're talking school finances, we're really talking about how we do our best to maintain our commitment to our kids and to our community through that shared partnership that Shakopee Public Schools has with the community. And as I mentioned just a little bit ago, we've got lots of information. There's information about this meeting, and then there's other information about much of the finance facts that will be shared during this presentation, and those can be found on our school district webpage, which is www.shakopee.k12.mn.us. And if you click on quick links and then on finance facts, it will take you to a new finance facts webpage. Also, once you've reviewed information on that webpage, we would ask that you please complete an input form. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to, that helps us provide clear and timely information, answer your questions, and make sure that we're explaining things in a clear way and doing so to your satisfaction. And there's a link right on the Finance Facts webpage for sharing via that input form. And then if you would like to submit questions for this meeting, we would ask that you send an email to communications@shakopee.k12.mn.us. And again, if you would like to ask questions at the end of this presentation, please send an email to that communications@shakopee.k12.mn.us. And we'll add those to our Q&A after I'm done giving this presentation. About a year ago now, we reached out to the community via a survey to get feedback, and we'd love to have those conversations with our stakeholders, whether it's students or teachers or community members. This survey happened to be from our community, and we wanted feedback to tell us how we're doing, to give us better focus in terms of those areas to improve and deliver even better services. As part of that survey, there were some real nice responses in these three areas. One was that 76% of the respondents have trust and confidence in our teachers. 72% feel the quality of Shakopee's education is comparable to or better than neighboring districts. And I'll come back to this as a theme a little bit during this presentation. You'll see that we're doing that even though we receive less in revenue than many of those districts. And so I would make the case that we're giving great value for the resources that we've been given to use to provide the services. And then 66% of residents, of residents with an opinion give Shakopee Public Schools an A or a B for education quality. Which is higher than the national benchmark. This question is asked on the Phi Delta Kappa nationwide survey on education. And so it's nice to get a score that's even higher than that on the national benchmark. Got a little frog in my throat. I'm going to try to clear that. So my apologies. Again, at the beginning, we're going to talk about finance and financial outlook, but I think it's really important to keep the focus where it should be, and that's on how do we best maintain our commitment to kids We've got a number of great things going in our district, and this slide just lists a few of those. You know, we've got highly trained and highly skilled teachers. We do lots of things to create small learning communities and real life experiences, culminating with the academies of Shakopee. We've got great learning throughout the district, E12. We've done a lot of work in the areas of literacy and reading and writing. Lots of extracurricular and athletic and other opportunities for our students to participate in. And then one thing I think we sometimes maybe take a little bit for granted, we've got great community partnerships for students and staff, an amazing wealth and breadth and depth of partnerships. And I think sometimes we think that happens everywhere, and it doesn't. So we really appreciate those partnerships. We've been traveling since the middle of March on a very unique and unusual journey. And during that journey, I'm amazingly proud of how our team, our 1,400 employees of our school district, and how our community has stepped up to those challenges. And a few numbers here to share with you that as of May 22nd, our food distribution team had delivered over 100,000 meals to kids. They're continuing with that program through at least the end of June, and we'll certainly take a look at extending that longer. During the distance learning part of the school year, the end of the school year, we had over 8,000 iPads or MacBooks in the hands of students to support them in distance learning. We also had 170 portable Wi-Fi access spots that went out to help students whose internet was a little bit shaky. And in our first survey, we're in the midst of a second survey, but in our first survey, 90% of parents agreed or strongly agreed that communication between their child and teacher was going well. Again, another example of we want to reach out, we want feedback. It helps us to do a better job of serving people. So please don't hesitate to share your thoughts on how we can do things better. We do appreciate that. And now I'm going to shift, and I'm really going to focus on the financial part of the presentation. And this slide is a comparative slide. What it does is it shows the revenue and expenses per student. We're the red bars on this slide, and it compares us to the metro average, which is the dark gray bars, and then the light gray bars are the state average. And if you look at the metro average, the typical school district in the metro receives about $1,800 per student each year more than we do. And then as one would expect, if you're receiving about $1,800 more per student, you're likely spending about $1,800 more per student. And that's what the bars on the right side of that page show. And so again, kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier. You know, it's an example of we really are, I think, providing great value for the resources that we're expending. All school districts, or nearly all school districts in Minnesota, have, you know, some form of funding challenge in terms of the state basic general education funding per student. And it's very simple why. If you compare what we've been receiving in this is our main source of funding from the state. If you take a look at that, we're the red line. That's what we've been receiving. If you would adjust that for just the rate of inflation, not talking anything extravagant, we would be receiving a little more than $5 million per year in revenue from the state. And that's a challenge that it's not Shakopee only. Many school districts in the area and across the state are feeling the effects of that. You know, the state aid not keeping up with the rate of inflation. On top of that, there are a couple other areas where I would argue that both state and federal funding haven't kept pace with the promises that were made. And to the tune in Shakopee, we pay nearly $9 million per year for unfunded mandates. And I want to be real clear here. The programming being funded is outstanding. We're talking about special education, and we're talking about English learner education. And so the programs themselves, the students are amazing. The staff that provides it do great work. The teachers do just outstanding things. But it's the fact that the state and federal government simply haven't provided the revenue that they said they would. And in Shakopee, that means we're taking, like I said earlier, about $9 million every year from our general fund to pay for those services and what we now refer to as the cross subsidy. This slide, a lot of words explaining what I just said, so I will not reread that or share that again. I'll simply move on. On this slide, you'll notice that Shakopee is on the far right, and we do not have a bar on this graph. This is a graph of voter-approved operating levies, and the school districts on this particular diagram are those that we call comparable districts. They have a lot in common with us, many similar characteristics. We perform with them, we compete against them, and so we use them as a benchmark of sorts for lots of things. I do think it's important to note that Shakopee Public Schools, in not having a voter-approved operating levy, that leaves us about $1,250 per student below the metro average in terms of voter-approved operating levies. The last time local voters here in Shakopee approved a voter-approved operating levy was more than a decade ago. And then I would turn your attention to the bottom of this slide, because you might be asking, all right, great, you compared to the metro average. Well, what does that mean in terms of total dollars? Well, and this is an if Shakopee were receiving the metro average in terms of voter-approved operating levies, we would be receiving about $11.4 million more per year in revenue. And again, I mentioned this early on. I won't read this slide to you, but just in case somebody joined us a little bit after the start, lots of information on our district webpage. There's a new Finance Facts webpage that has this presentation and lots of other information. Also there, you can find an input form. We'd love to hear your voice on these subjects or on this subject. And then if you would like to ask a question for us to answer at the end of this meeting, please send an email to communications@shakopee.k12.mn.us, and we'd be happy to answer that question when I'm through the slides. This is my least favorite slide of the entire presentation. This diagram, this graph shows really about a decade of school district fund balance history. I'm not going to relitigate the left side of the diagram, but that's absolutely not what you want to happen. You should notice in the middle of the diagram, there's a gray bar. That's the fund balance goal. And you should notice that hopefully in the past 3 years, you'll see there on the kind of the right side of this diagram, you've seen we've been trending in the right direction, moving upwards towards that fund balance goal. And that was largely due to budget cuts over the last few years. You'll notice that when we look at next school year, the 2021 school year, we're now projecting a $2.5 million deficit. In other words, our revenues are projected to be $2.5 million less than our expenditures. Certainly a problem, certainly a challenge, and something that's why we're here tonight. We're looking for ways to address this impending financial challenge. And the only way you can fix that problem, there's three ways. There's only three options to rebuild it, to rebuild the fund balance, and that is, number one, you cut expenses. Number two, you increase revenue. Or three, you do a combination of both of those things. And even though we're talking in the millions of dollars in a large school district budget, it ultimately boils down to simple math. Our expenses, they have to be less than or equal revenue. And unfortunately, that's not what our future looks like beginning next school year. And again, just to reiterate, we need to fix that math problem. We need to make budget cuts, or we need to increase revenue. And really the only viable path to increasing revenue is through a voter-approved operating levy, or we need to do both of those things. And sometimes I think when we talk, we talk finance and we talk money, we sometimes lose the why. We lose that foundation. And in our case, this discussion, this challenge, I don't think we want to lose that why. The reason why we're taking a look, why we need to do a good job managing our finances in the district, boils down to three things. Number one, maintaining the quality programming and learning opportunities for students. Number 2, continue to attract, retain, and fairly compensate high-quality teachers. And then number 3, build a path to long-term financial stability. Not going to spend a long time on this spreadsheet. This is put together by our finance director, Bill Manazzi, and his team, but using numbers and using a fair amount of accounting and expenditures and revenues. You'll see where I've got my cursor pointed, that's that projected $2.5 million deficit at the end of next school year. If you go out to the future years, you'll notice those numbers get worse. You'll also notice those numbers are now in strike-through font. We're not going to let that happen. We can't let that happen. And you may notice that up here, when you look at the 21-22 and 22-23 school years, with the shape of the state's fund balance projections, it's likely that not only will state funding not keep pace with inflation on those years, it may actually be flat. And if you took all that data from that spreadsheet and you boiled it down into just a couple pieces of key information, I would ask that you focus on the budget deficits. Next school year, we're projecting one of $2.5 million. The year after that, 5.8. And again, if nothing is done, this is what would happen, but that's not the case. We're going to do something. But if we let those deficits run without any intervention, our fund balance would be down to $1.1 million at the end of next year. And then the following year would be a negative $4.7 million. And again, we're not going to do that. That's why we're here. We need to find a path forward and tackle our impending financial challenges. I do want to start with number 3 on that why, that path to long-term financial stability. And then I'm going to come back and address both budget cuts and revenue. I think it's important, and it would be my strong recommendation that after we work through the budget adjustments that are needed here in the near term, that beginning with the 22-23 school year and then continuing each year after, that we set an explicit goal of adding at least $500,000 to our unassigned fund balance, and that we keep doing that as a district until we reach $10 million, which would put us smack in the middle of that gray bar that I showed on an earlier slide. And you might ask, well, why such specific numbers? Well, I think it's really important. This is another degree of accountability. It's, there's no place to hide. Either you're putting $500,000 into the unassigned fund balance or you're not. And either you're doing that until it reaches $10 million or you're not. And I know that we'll reach those goals should we set them. Again, I would say my suggestion would be in examining our, the financial state and outlook of our district, that we need to take a serious look at both types of budget adjustments. We need to cut expenses. We need to do that through permanent budget cuts. And then I would also suggest that we need to increase revenue. And again, the only viable way is through an operating levy. And in the state of Minnesota, such a levy requires voter approval. I'm going to start with the budget cuts. And this is irrespective of any levy or any revenue enhancement. I believe we need to cut slightly over $2 million, starting with $450,000 for next school year, and then continuing with an additional $1.6 million for the 21-22 school year. And then it's an important note on the bottom of this page. None of this slightly over $2 million in cuts are classroom teachers. And then I also believe we need to seriously consider increasing revenue with an operating levy. In Minnesota, a school district can only go out for an operating levy on the first Tuesday of November. This year, that would be November 3rd. And if I'd have given this presentation 4 months ago, at that time, we were, beginning to explore what I would call traditional forms of operating levies. And in a traditional operating levy, a school district typically picks a dollar amount per pupil, brings that to the voters who approve it on that first Tuesday in November, And then that's payable entirely in the next year, and the revenue is received by the school district then for the school year that follows. Well, in light of the current economic situation in our community and the state and the country, that seems far too aggressive and seems inappropriate. And so as a district, we've been looking at something called a phased-in levy. And in a phased-in levy, rather than receiving the total levy amount all at once, the levy revenue is phased in over a period of time, typically 3 or 4 years. And because that levy request is broken into smaller chunks over time, the tax impact is also then phased in over time. To me, that's a much more prudent, conservative, and respectful approach for taxpayers. Just to give you an inkling or a little idea of what a phased-in levy might look like, and also to be used as a planning tool for our district leadership team and then the school board, finding it's much easier to give critical feedback, if you have an idea in front of you and alter it or change it or throw it out or, do whatever you want with it, than to build an idea from scratch. We've just got 3 quick slides here on phased-in levies, just to give you a sense of what they might look like. The first one would ask for $1,000 per pupil, but it does it over 4 years. You'll see, over here are the budget reductions that I talked about, that $2 million over the next 2 years. You'll see a levy revenue coming in over 4 years. You'll see hitting that $500,000 fund balance goal. And then if we go on to another one, this one would be $900 per pupil, phased in over 3 years in $300 increments. Again, you see the budget reductions. There's another one in this, looming in the 22-23 school year. I'm hoping we've got some financial good news. We've been tightening our belt. We've been, pushing for cost savings here, even at the end of this school year and into next school year. And I think we can hopefully tackle that part of the challenge outside of the budget cuts that I've talked about previously. But you'll see where this levy is phased in over 3 years, again, hitting that $500,000 per year fund balance goal. And then the third one is another $900 per pupil levy in over 4 years, $300 increments in the first 2 years, and then $150 increments in years 3 and 4. And similar to the previous one, you've got the budget cuts. You've got the levy being phased in over time. You're hitting the fund balance targets. You then also have another budget challenge potentially looming in the 25-26 school year. And again, these are just to be used for planning to help shape ideas, kind of a starting place or kind of a holder, a discussion starter, if you will. There is one piece of financial good news. Due to construction debt being paid off, we have the opportunity to increase revenue via an operating levy without increasing residents' taxes. In other words, over the next 2 years, we're finishing paying off the loans for construction, some of them, and that amount that is leaving the tax rolls, if it were to be replaced by a phased-in levy option, any of the 3 that I showed, that would offset that increase. In other words, the amount of taxes coming off from the construction debt is slightly greater than the amount of operating revenue taxes that would be coming on, across our district. And then, of course, there'd be a slight increase in years 2 through 4. And certainly as we get further down the planning road, much, much more information to come in regards to the tax impact. This is my second least favorite slide of the presentation. And this is, let's just say that, there is no voter-approved operating levy on November 3rd, or there is a voter-approved operating levy on the ballot on November 3rd, and, more members of our community vote no than vote yes. In that case, we would need to make an additional $5.4 million in budget cuts for the 21-22 school year. This time the cuts the cuts are also going to impact classroom teachers. They would impact just about everything across the district, and they would have a significant impact on our ability to provide services. And yes, this additional $5.4 million in budget cuts is in addition to the little over 2 million in no matter what budget cuts that I talked about previously. And that does then add up to just slightly under $7.5 million in budget cuts for the 21-22 school year. I'm not going to read this entire slide. I've talked about this. You know, from my vantage point, I don't believe we can cut our way out of this problem. It'd be too draconian. We wouldn't really recognize our district when we were done. By the same token, I don't believe that we can increase revenue to solve the problem alone. And especially now, that just seems to be, you know, it doesn't seem to be a prudent or respectful approach. And so I believe a combination of both budget cuts and a phased-in levy would be a conservative, respectful approach that shares the burden. Our school board has been working on this. We restarted on May 18th. The timeline was sidetracked, as were many, many other timelines due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But on May 18th at the board meeting, we began to share our budget planning and began to look at options for long-term budget adjustments and solutions to the financial challenges that are looming beginning this next school year and continuing in the years after. In June and July, a lot of review, a lot of discussion, a lot of study of budget adjustment options. And then as of now, July 20th, the school board is scheduled to vote on those long-term budget adjustment options. In other words, the solution for the best path forward for our school district in terms of financial management. And I'd like to wrap up with one more slide from that survey a year ago. At that time, 93% of our residents agreed that strong public schools are directly linked to the quality of life and viability of our community. And I'd just like to say, I believe in our community. I believe in our schools. I know that working together that we'll find the best path forward. We certainly have a challenge on our hands, but I know that, like I said, we'll find that best path forward and we'll work together to do the best we can to continue to serve our kids to the best of our ability. And again, lots of information on our website. We'd love it if you took a look at that website and shared your feedback and thoughts and questions via the input form there. And if you've got any questions for myself or Board Chair Christy Peterson or Finance Director Bill Manazzi, we'd love to answer those here in the next few minutes. Please send those questions by email to communications@shakopee.k12.mn.us. And again, thank you for being here this evening. Thank you for joining this conversation.
And Mike, I have placed our first submitted question in the chat. You should see it there.
All right, it's a two-part question. Is there any discussion about having less administration? Is the district considering cutting support staff, i.e. school counselors, social workers, school psychologists, et cetera, as part of the potential budget cuts? And the short answer is unfortunately, it's yes to both questions. But where those budget cuts fall in the process is yet to be fully determined. Ultimately, the school board makes that decision. But our leadership team is preparing budget proposals, which will be shared with the full board at the June 22nd meeting. And in those budget proposals, the cuts fall into three groups. One, we're looking to do some belt tightening. Like I said, we started the end of this school year, continuing through next school year and cutting $450,000 there. That's followed by a round of cuts for the 21-22 school year totaling $1.6 million. Those cuts do result in less administration. In answer to the question. And again, just to reiterate, I know I shared it in the presentation, they do not include any classroom teaching positions. And should we not have an infusion of revenue or new revenue in the form of an operating levy, or if we don't hold an operating levy, we're preparing to make an additional $5.4 million in budget cuts on top of the ones I previously mentioned. Those cuts, they would impact classroom teachers. They would impact nearly every type of employee across the district, including some of those mentioned by the questioner, things like counselors. So thank you for that question. See, there's another one here. And that is, what is the dollar amount for the proposed levy? Christy, okay taking that one?
Sure, I can take that one. So the board has not decided on a dollar amount of what a proposed levy would consist of. I think that part of the reason why we're doing these information sessions with the community is to gather some feedback from the community on some what their feelings are, as well as I know that Mike and Bill and rest of the administration leadership in the district, they are working on various scenarios to provide to the board to give us a better idea of what avenue might be the best for our district moving forward. So the answer to the question is no, we don't have that information at this time, but we will likely make that decision at the July 20th school board meeting.
Got to turn the microphone back on if I expect to be heard. Boy, that's a simple question. What are we planning for this fall? Not directly related to the levy. Do we have a couple hours? We've begun working, and really what we've been doing is researching. We're certainly in a unique and unprecedented situation. I know our leadership team and others, we're actually looking at ideas around the world. We're studying, hey, what's happened when different places have gone back to school, what's working, what isn't working. We formed a district learning leadership team, and this has members of our district leadership. It has principals, it has teachers. We're getting together for a series of 4 pretty long meetings right in the middle of June, trying to take a look at what the Department of Education now says we should prepare for, which is 3 types of learning. In-person, distance learning, or a combination of those two in the form of hybrid learning. So we're really, we're expecting to do a lot of the legwork, a lot of the digging, a lot of the planning in the middle of June. The Department of Ed has said they will let us know no later than July 27th, which form or forms, I guess it could be, of those 3 types of learning will be allowed to use starting starting this 2021 school year. Certainly, again, that's another topic if people have ideas or thoughts. Ultimately, we want to do the absolute best we can to serve our community, serve our kids. We get that balance. We always get that balance between we want to keep kids safe. We want to do everything we can to help them learn and grow and become the amazing individuals that they are. But certainly we don't have all the answers yet, but we're assembling information and we'll begin, we've already begun to start boiling some of that down. But right now there's lots of thoughts, lots of information, and we're looking for additional guidance from the Department of Health and Department of Ed, and we'll do the absolute best we can. So I think, Bill, this one's for you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll jump in on this one. The answer to the question is, yeah, we did see some variances on both the revenue and the expenditure side of the ledger. As Dr. Redmond mentioned, since March 18th, we started.
Bill, do you mind if we back up and just state the question? The question is, didn't the district save a lot of money this last quarter since kids weren't there since mid-March? Sorry, yep. Bill.
So the answer to that question is we did see savings on both the revenue and changes on the expenditure side as well. So the savings on the expenditure side were more categorical type items and were not significant to the bottom line. Think in terms of savings in substitute teaching budgets, instructional supplies, and limited savings in transportation. Although our contracted transportation provider is still providing service in terms of meal delivery, transportation of childcare of essential workers. Now, on the flip side, on the revenue side, we have seen some variances on the revenue side as well. Obviously, our food service fund, our community service fund, those are largely fee-based funds. And as school is not physically in session since March 18th, we've seen a decrease in those fee-based funds as well. And then just to finish up, student activities, so spring sports, we've seen a decrease in revenue related to some of that as well this spring. So variances on both the revenue and the expenditure side. On the expenditure side, we don't feel like it's significant to the overall general fund bottom line.
So I'll take this one. This question is in regards to Shakopee School's use of Apple devices for students. This individual is wondering if we could reduce our capital expenditures and operational costs by moving primarily to Chromebooks. So the answer to that is there's kind of several layers to that, but part of it is that our curriculum expectations, the total cost and ownership of Apple devices, and ensuring that our students are receiving the tools that they need are why we choose Apple products as our hardware platform. And maybe some of you know that Apple devices do carry their value. So over time, as we roll through our devices and they get turned in, we can refurbish them and reuse them for other purposes, as well as we go out and sell some of the older devices, and they do bring in back to us some pretty good value into our district, which is then put in back into our technology department. As far as the Chromebooks go, we've observed in researching with other districts that use the Chromebooks that the life of a Chromebook isn't quite as strong as an Apple device, which is why the district has selected Apple products moving forward. So I think that should answer that question.
Looks like another one on the budget forecast. No, the budget forecast for fiscal 21 for next year did not take into account the possibility of continued distance learning at this point. We start our budget assumptions for the next fiscal year way back last winter, obviously before all this happened. And as Dr. Redmond mentioned, we don't exactly know what the fall is going to look like, whether it's continued distance learning, a blend of online and in-person learning. We're still waiting on some guidance related to that. But any change to the normal start to the school year, we would need to reflect that in the revised budget for fiscal 21, because it is not in our budget assumptions right now to start anything other than a normal start to next school year.
And we have another question. The question is, with COVID-19 putting a stop to many, if not all, Shakopee citizens' employment, where is the money going to come from?
I'll take a stab at answering that. And that's, like I mentioned in the presentation, typically an operating levy, if we were to go that route, is, it's a dollar amount, it's voted on, and then it happens in 1 year. We have a unique situation, at least, for the first year of any of the phased-in levy ideas that I shared, that taxes would be neutral across our district. We've got some construction debt falling off. And so even adding that operating levy with that much needed revenue that first year would have no, it would have no growth in terms of the overall tax rate. And we're studying, even looking at home values between $50,000 and $1 million. And I believe on options 2 and 3, all of those homes, none of them would see a tax increase. I think on option 1, where the $400 is phased in on that first year, Some, houses in a lower value might see a very, very small increase. But I think when, we've begun to do that exploration, look at it that way. And certainly we get that economic condition. It's a balance though. We owe it, to our students to do the absolute best we can to provide services for their education. We want to engage in that conversation with the community. We're the only government entity in the state of Minnesota that we don't get to set our operating levy. We have to have a conversation with the voters, and I think there's some positives in that, and certainly some challenges. And so we're trying to sort this out together as a school board, a district leadership team, and probably most importantly, a community that, I know wants to do the best we can for our kids, but we always have to operate within limited resources, and we're just trying to share the situation and find that best path forward. So I appreciate that question.
And our next question, why are we receiving less per student than other schools in the metro and state?
Well, and Bill, I can tackle this, or Bill and Christy, if you want to hop in. Well, I think when we look at the comparisons, and you saw it in that audit report, we get the same per pupil amount, that's across the state, that's our core funding. But noting that core funding, that hasn't kept pace with the rate of inflation since 2003. And I should point out, this isn't a Shakopee problem. You don't have to look very far. And I may get the dollar figures slightly off, but Eastern Carver County for next year, I want to say they're cutting somewhere in the neighborhood just under $5 million. Prior Lake, I believe, is cutting somewhere, $2.5 to $3 million. And I believe Burnsville's cuts for next year are in the neighborhood of $7.5 million. They all have greater voter-approved operating levies than do we. And so they're facing those challenges in terms of state funding, just like we are. But other school districts in the metro, that stat is on average, they receive, $1,250 per pupil every year in revenue from a voter-approved operating levy that we don't. And if we were at that metro average, we would have an $11 million, a little over $11 million per year. And certainly that would go a long ways. That would solve our financial challenge. And so we're trying to find that right balance between budget cuts. We get that structurally we've got to be sound. We've got to live within our means, but also what is that right size, and how do we continue to provide that great value for the money that we've been doing? And that's what that's the challenge we face. And, we're trying to work that out and resolve that here in the next month or so. The school board certainly has, they've got a lot on their plates and a tough decision in, July 20th.
Our next question, would it be prudent to change our methods of teaching and our class options to be more pragmatic and return to the core competencies of math, science, and English?
Well, I'm gonna share two answers on this. If we're talking just purely a financial lens, you've got kids in school for X amount of minutes in front of a teacher, those class sizes. What you're teaching doesn't change that financial structure. Now, unless you remove, like all extracurricular activities and sports and all those things, which I have zero interest in doing, and I think that would be an abomination. I believe those are co-curricular, and you want a varied learning experience. I think we've got one of the reasons I wanted to come to Shakopee. I absolutely love what we're doing with the academies of Shakopee and throughout the system. I think we've recognized that learning doesn't just take place within a school building. We want authentic, deep learning experiences for each of our students. We want to connect with professionals and experts in all kinds of areas. And so I think we're much, much more. And I think also if we're looking at the world that we're preparing our students for, I think it involves a deep, broad, varied learning experience. I think we're doing a great job in regards. I think other people look at us with a lot of envy in what we're currently doing. I also know they look at us and go, how are you doing it based on the revenue that you're receiving? And I've got peers in the, in the metro area that go, you're the only one without a voter approved operating levy, yet you're doing some really, really good things for kids. And so At the start, I think it's from a financial perspective, I really don't think it saves money. Whether the kid is taking an art class or a math class, we pay those, just looking at it through an economic lens, we pay the teacher the same rate for the, basically the same number of kids, over the same period of time. So from a financial lens, I really don't think there's savings. From an educational lens, to me, that doesn't sound like a great high school. It doesn't sound like an aspiration for what we are currently and what I believe we can be even better in the future. So hopefully I answered that question.
For our next submitted question, why does the school district need to provide daycare, breakfast, and other non-educational services?
I guess I'll jump into that one. I think it's, it goes back to Maslow's needs hierarchy. If kids need services like that, we need to provide those. Technically, we don't provide the typical childcare. That's a service provided by the YMCA, the before and after school care. They do that on a fee for service. When we talk about breakfast and lunch, having been in the classroom for a long time, I had a drawer full of granola bars and things like that. Goes back to that Maslow's need hierarchy. It's tough to learn when you're hungry. And we have a fair number of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, which is an indicator of economic challenges and an indicator of poverty. And we're reimbursed fully for those meals that were provided. When we provide those services for students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, we're reimbursed by the state and federal governments. I think it helps us to learn. It's awfully tough to learn math or art or science or anything else if your stomach's growling. So from a school district standpoint, if let's just say we quit serving breakfast to students who receive free and reduced lunch, it wouldn't change our overall financial picture. We're reimbursed fully for that service. So, and the same at lunch when we provide that for students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. The other students are a fee-based service. We break even on that. So, and then, like I said, the child care is provided by the YMCA. So if you take those two specific things, we break even on that. And so that that really has no bearing on our overall financial picture, if you will.
Have salary cuts over the entire employee base been considered? If so, how much?
These are great questions. They're tough questions. I think you think about it, it's not that easy. I think some people, we don't live in a world where, the school board or the superintendent gets to wave a magic wand and go, yep, you're going to make X amount less next year. Now, we have as a district leadership team, the superintendent and assistant superintendent and all our directors, we voluntarily taken a pay freeze for next year. Our work agreements with a number of our units, the largest being our teachers, who make up about 60% of our expenditures in the district, they have a collective bargaining agreement. I do not have the authority or the ability to unilaterally make any decisions. We certainly are looking at, the whole picture of the district. We're looking at the things that we do control, and that is we can control budget cuts in the form of positions and programs and activities. We're certainly looking at ways, to find efficiencies, eliminate redundancies, and constrain costs where we can. But I know I've heard that, and I've actually heard that from after the staff presentations that, well, why don't we figure out what the total dollar amount is that you need and just have everybody take that exact percentage cut? On the one hand, yeah, that would work in terms of the math. It just doesn't work in terms of reality. There's nothing to compel many of the people to do that, and we simply don't have the authority to do that.
Didn't we just approve a levy a few years ago?
I'll give you a break on that one, Mike. I'll take this question. We did in 2015, the voters approved a building bond to build Shakopee High School. And building bonds are different than operating levies. So when you think about a building bond, that is used to build a building. So bonds is building. Operating levies is really used for learning. Those dollars are used for in the classroom to pay the teachers, to pay our staff, to offer the some of the extra programming that we need to offer for our students, transportation, classroom supplies, etc. So the real difference between the two, just so everyone understands, is that a building bond that was approved for 2015 for the high school expansion is just that. We can only use the money for building. This, what we are considering when we talk about an operating levy, would be dollars that we can use in the classroom that are above what we would get on a per pupil basis from the state of Minnesota.
Why is Shakopee one of the only districts in the metro area without an operating levy?
You're muted, Mike.
That's good. The first part of my answer wasn't very good. No. That's one of those questions that we could sit down and we could discuss for hours and hours. I think it's a number of things, have led to that reality. I think, number one, it's at core, as a community, we know that we want to provide good services for our kids, but we want to do that within a reasonable cost structure, and I think we've done that. It's sometimes a little bit easier to do that if your enrollment is growing. So there are some benefits if you're in a district that's had rapid enrollment growth, which we had for an extended period of time not too long ago. That enrollment growth has kind of flattened out and even decreased, and that's really a result of the last recession, kind of the late 2008 in that range, and just we're not seeing as many kids coming into the schools. Our larger classes are at the high school. And so, there's a variety of factors. And I think there's some big factors. And some of it is, we had that enrollment growth at just the right time. A lot of other districts used to look at operating levies. In fact, if we were having this conversation, 12, 15 years ago, the term we described these levies with was excess levy. At the time they were started off, they were something about, excess or getting extras or doing those kind of above and beyond things. Well, the reality is, and it's in relation to the diagram I showed earlier, when state aid doesn't keep pace with inflation over an extended period of time, the diagram I showed was 17 years, but you could go back another decade or so. School districts have begun to rely on, over the last decade, more and more operating levies, not to provide excess or extra, but to provide those core services. And I think for a variety of reasons, we've arrived at that point today where we look at where we are. We look at, we think we're doing some great things for kids. I know we are. We look at the cost of those and how do you sustain that. Other districts have probably faced that reality, maybe a little bit sooner than we have. And all you have to do is, look at the larger districts, the metro districts that don't have voter-approved operating levies. The only ones I can think of, that would qualify for that are Shakopee, St. Francis, and St. Cloud. Every other district in the greater metro area, and we're talking greater metro when you're going all the way to St. Francis and St. Cloud. So we're kind of unique in that situation. I think there's a lot of factors, and I'm sure there's others if we open it up to this panel, but that maybe is a discussion for another day.
Our next question, what would an operating levy cost me?
I'll jump in on this one, and I don't want to steal the thunder too much from the upcoming board meeting this evening. There is a board meeting at 6 o'clock where we're going to touch on the subject a little bit, just sort of as an introductory, and then in much more detail at the next meeting on June 22nd. But Dr. Edmond touched on this a little bit. We do have a unique opportunity to look at increasing operating revenue without increasing taxes due to this debt relief that our taxpayers are going to see in their pay 2021 property tax statements. So the three options that are sort of being discussed are tax neutral or a very, very small impact on one of the options at a lower price home at pay 21, and then obviously some increases in pay 22 and forward. And then just to answer the question, once we do get an opportunity to discuss this at the board meeting on tonight on June 8th, and then again on June 22nd, we will put individual operating levy and taxpayer impact information on the school district website in the form of a tax impact calculator. And so you can look at that or look for that later this month, or certainly after the operating levy is decided at the meeting on July 20th.
Thank you, Bill. Our next question. Your slides state you are focused on attracting, retaining, and paying quality teachers. What about the many other staff who aren't teachers who help support a high quality education? Examples, paraprofessionals, custodial, kitchen, and office. Schools couldn't run without them.
Yeah, that slide isn't meant to in any way be dismissive of all the members of our team. But when we look at the district and we do comparative analysis of, who we retract, how we retain, and what we pay, the group with the most kind of glaring challenge compared to, again, those comparable districts is our teachers. That they lag a little bit further behind their peers in those comparable districts than do the employees in the other work groups that you mentioned. And again, that's just trying to be real specific and calling that out. And that was something that, if you followed the board, and follow board meetings, that was, with the most recent teacher negotiations and collective bargaining agreement, we attempted to address to some degree. And so we're just trying to point that out. And then also, I think it, in some ways it goes without saying, those teachers are the people closest to the kids. That ultimately is where the rubber hits the road. And again, teachers can't do a great job if everybody else in the district isn't doing a fantastic job. And that doesn't mean we don't appreciate those. We were just calling out really that one specific situation. So again, great question. I appreciate the nature of that question. And we've got amazing employees in every work group.
Our next question, what will the questions be on the November 2020 ballot?
Christy, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure, Mike. That's yet to be determined. The board is still gathering information in regards to all of the options that we are wrestling with. This is not an easy decision by the board at all, and to be determined as to even if there will be something on the ballot. We've got all options are on the table right now. We will make a decision as to what we are going to do by July 20th or at that July 20th meeting, whether we will have an operating levy or if it will be just budget cuts or a combination of the two. But that is to be determined at this time. Follow our board meetings, I guess, for more information as we try to make these decisions, but it's definitely not an easy decision that the board will be making.
And I believe we have time for one more question, Mike, before we wrap up this community conversation. Our last question, what happened to the fund balance? Why was it spent down?
Well, when I touched on that slide that showed that fund balance history, and that's my least favorite slide on this presentation. And I'm not going to relitigate the past. I'm not going to get into those specifics. The reality, it's that simple math. We were expending more money than we were bringing in revenues. But, I think the one thing that does bear pointing out is that money was being spent to provide services to students. And so, again, as we've looked at that and you've seen the evidence over the last 3 years, when you're providing those services to students, it's imperative you live within your means. And that's why we're here tonight. That's why we've been sharing what we can and whenever we can about the financial challenges that the impending financial challenges facing our district. you know, we're talking about, you know, next year, and we're talking about the year after that. So that to me is the time when you should be having those conversations about the challenges, not after the fact. After the fact, you've got very limited choices in how to deal with it. I think the district has done a pretty good job the last 3 years at getting that fund balance trending in the correct direction. But those budget cuts aren't enough to sustain that long term, or to sustain that over the next year or handful of years. And that's what we're looking at, is how do we tackle the challenge for next year? But it's bigger than that. It's the year after. It's trying to find a better sense of structural balance in terms of revenues and expenditures. And again, we're doing that by engaging in a conversation with the community. We're continuing tonight at tonight's board meeting, the June 22nd board meeting, and then the July 20th board meeting. So I appreciate all, you know, the folks who've spent time tuned in this evening. Again, would invite you to join the school board meeting at 6 p.m. And we do appreciate those questions. And if you think of one, you know, after we sign off here, please, you know, send it to communications@shakopee.k12.mn.us. We would love to address those questions. We'd love to continue to engage in that conversation. So with that, I think that brings us to a close, unless there's anything else. All right, that was my pause. And so again, thank you for joining us. And my tagline on my emails, every day is a great day to be a Sabre. And thanks for being here for this community conversation.